In this video, I should drink this. It's empty. Hello, Zer0 Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. And in this video, I'll be exploring the idea of dialectics from Hegel by considering the philosophical problem of solipsism and the cultural and political problem of narcissism. What I hope to do is argue persuasively that a Hegelian approach to politics and philosophy might enlighten us, or at least lead us out of the impasse. And I'll be using the film The Nines in order to make my case. Along the way, I'll also take some excerpts from the Zer0 Books titles A Left for Itself and Can the Left Learn to Meme? But before we dive into philosophical argumentation, let's consider solipsism as a political rather than as a philosophical difficulty. Since the early 1970s, a common complaint made against liberal democratic societies, and especially against America, is that they engender narcissistic, consumerist tendencies in their citizens. Now, when the critic Christopher Lasch spoke of narcissism, he didn't just mean self-centeredness, and he wasn't referring to mere vanity, but rather the psychological condition of narcissism. For Lasch, the narcissism that 20th century America generated had more to do with self-hate than self-love. It was characterized not by self-admiration so much as by inner emptiness, repressed rage, unsatisfied oral cravings, and a fear of dependence. Most of all, according to Lasch, narcissism was a reaction against a social world that failed to provide enough objective support for a child's developing ego. For Lasch, the prevalence of narcissism was a result of a society that undermined family relations, devalued paternal authority, and offered instead only individualized consumer pleasures and anonymous state authority. However, what I would point out is that the problem of narcissism can be recast in philosophical terms as the problem of solipsism. The point of such a reframing would be to demonstrate both how the undermining of traditional values, and with it the notion of an objective foundation for society, was expressed philosophically, and how philosophy might help us understand how to overcome the impasse of our modern narcissistic condition. Rather than concern ourselves with communal life, family life, or fathers, let's instead consider Cartesian rationality and its consequences. So I want to explain Descartes' cogito to you. That is, I want to explain his argument from his Meditations on First Philosophy that you can know a necessary truth about the world, and that truth is best summed up in the phrase, I think, therefore I am. Now, in the Meditations, Descartes tried to doubt everything that was possible to doubt, and that included his own perceptions of the world. That included what he saw and what he heard and what he tasted, because he realized that while it was true that most of the time your senses are a good guide to what's true in the world, that you do have these moments where the senses can't be relied upon, and you are never able to be sure if you're within one of those moments or not. Of course, what Descartes was referring to were dreams, and he had had dreams where he thought he was awake. I've had those dreams. I think you've probably had those dreams. So, given that he couldn't know whether or not he was dreaming, and further, given that he didn't know for sure whether or not there was an evil genius that was intent on deceiving him, Descartes had to look past the senses, give up on the body, abandon the notion that he could even know for sure whether or not there was space or time in the world, or whether there was such a thing as extension. But what he couldn't doubt, and I said it at the beginning, what he couldn't doubt was that he was doubting, that there was a subject that was having the experience of even these false things. Even if he was dreaming, couldn't doubt that he was a dreamer. He could not doubt that since he was thinking, he was. In The Science of Logic, Hegel explores Descartes' supposedly undoubtable truth and proceeds to strip away the last illusion. Hegel finds what can still be doubted even after one realizes that thinking implies subjective being, or I think, therefore I am. Hegel wrote, "We cannot leave entirely unmentioned a more original beginning to philosophy, which has recently gained notoriety. The beginning with the I. The I, this immediate consciousness of the self, appears from the start to be both itself an immediate something, and something with which we are acquainted in a much deeper sense than with any other representation. True, anything else known belongs to this I, but it belongs to it as a content which remains distinct from it, and is therefore accidental. The I, by contrast, is the simple certainty of itself. But the I is, as such, at the same time, also a concrete, or rather, the I is the most concrete of all things, the consciousness of itself as the infinitely manifold world." According to Hegel, the concept of the I is something we know because of its content, because of the way the outside world presents itself to us as a multitude of concrete content for us. He goes on to say that before the I can be the beginning and foundation of philosophy, this concrete world must be excised. What would be left after excising all the many doubtable concrete facts that present themselves to our I? Nothing but an abstract I. This abstraction is not an immediate graspable fact about the world at all, but is only the product of a certain philosophical argumentation. Hegel says, "We lose the very advantage which was to derive from this beginning of philosophy, namely, that it is something with which everyone is well acquainted, something which everyone finds within himself, and to which he can attach further reflection. That pure I, on the contrary, in its abstract essential nature, is to ordinary consciousness an unknown something that the latter does not find within itself." What Hegel demonstrates is that the singular I, when understood as the foundation of true knowledge, when shorn of all problematic or subjective concrete particularities, loses its immediacy and its sensuousness precisely when it can no longer separate its own existence from the objective and distant universality of what is taken to be the external world. What Hegel demonstrates, even before he truly begins his science of logic through the consideration of being, is to show how dialectics works through the movement of concepts into their opposites. I want to explain how the solipsistic ego becomes an abstract and alienated substance in a more accessible way by taking up the dialectics of Ryan Reynolds in the 2007 film The Nines. In the movie The Nines, Reynolds plays three characters that are really one character. He plays a man who's not really a man at all, but some kind of god. In the film, Reynolds slowly realizes that the world he's in is a world of his own creation, a world that he is ultimately responsible for, but also a world that, since it is his creation, isn't real. Once the realization fully sets in, what happens is that a new world, a divine world filled with gods, is revealed to him. This is a dramatic and metaphorical working out of what Hegel explained at the beginning of the science of logic. By taking himself as the source of reality, Ryan Reynolds is immediately confronted by two new realities. There is a divine realm beyond him, and he is not presently capable of understanding this new divine fact in anything but an abstracted way. This is what happens when Reynolds says, "I think, therefore I am." He loses the world outside of himself and then loses any clear conception of his self along with it. Being the source of all that exists means that Reynolds no longer has a ground to walk on.
I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind, and my guest today is a most accomplished and prolific social critic whose earlier works, such as The Minimal Self and particularly The Culture of Narcissism, have long since established him as foremost among those who would identify what is, in truth, the promise of American life. Christopher Lasch teaches history at the University of Rochester.
In an essay written for the New York Review of Books in 1976, Lasch wrote that the prevailing attitude amongst the boomer generation was present-oriented and self-involved. He wrote that boomer logic went something like this. Since society has no future, it makes sense to live only for the moment, to fix our eyes on our own private performance, to become connoisseurs of our own decadence, to cultivate a transcendental self-attention. Now, there are 2 points to make in response to the description of boomer logic. The first is that transcendental self-attention is perhaps a good description of the philosophical injunction to know thyself, an injunction that, if followed, will lead not merely to the disintegration of the self as one knows it, but to a dissolution of the self and the transformation of the self into its opposite. That is, when one considers oneself in detail, tries to spell out all the constituent parts, what one finds is a list of sociological or demographic facts. For instance, Douglas Lane was born in 1970 and is a member of Generation X. Douglas Lane is a white straight male. Douglas Lane was raised on television and mass-produced toys. Now, I could go on and on in this vein, mentioning my marriage, the toothpaste I use, my parents' professions, and so on, but none of these facts are who I am in myself. These are all objective facts that define who I am for others, who I am socially, or who I am in society. In order to transcend what is merely particular about me, or what I am as an object, I would have to strip these things away and consider myself as an essence or as an abstraction. I would be reduced to a mere I, which could then be seen to be a mere abstract being, which itself would amount to nothing. What is decadent is not merely what is pleasurable or gratifying. Like narcissism, decadence has a philosophical meaning as well as an everyday meaning. According to Nietzsche, for example, what is decadent is what is abstract or non-sensuous. Coming out of his critique of Christianity, his idea of decadence involves denying one's own vitality and, in fact, one's pleasure in life. But this decadence or decay, from a dialectical perspective, can't be separated out from notions of change and reconstitution, or even rebirth. And for Hegel, decadence springs from the immediate vitality that one confronts in the world. Just as the master creates the slave's victory in Hegel's master and slave dialectic, the immediate, vital, and sensuous becomes its opposite due to its own self-contradiction. Still, if decadence leads to decay and rebirth, if the narcissist is bound to become a solipsist and through that find the objective world, if only in an abstract form, then why is it that socialism has not yet arrived? If our concepts are dialectical, then why is it that we seem to be in a permanent stasis, guarded by Pepe the Frog and cat memes? In his book, Can the Left Learn to Meme?, Zer0 Books author Mike Watson attempts to discover or rediscover the dialectic in internet culture by turning to Adorno. He quotes Adorno from page 54 of Minima Moralia. The pictorial jokes which fill the magazines are for the most part pointless, empty of meaning. Schooled by innumerable prior cases, one is supposed to see what's happening faster than the significant moments of the situation are developing. What such pictures act out, in anticipation of their completion by the well-versed observer, is the throwing off all meaning overboard, like ballast in the snapshot of the situation, in the unresisting subjugation to the empty hegemony of things. The state-of-the-art joke is a suicide of intention. When considering this quote from Adorno, what we should ask is whether this destruction of intention might itself be turned into its opposite, namely the discovery of a new aim.
If we want to defeat capitalism, we are going to need a party that will organize working people to fight for the demands that we want and to win socialism. Thank you so much.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronouns?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
Okay.
Let's consider David Swift's book, A Left for Itself. In it, Swift echoes both Hegel and Adorno as he rails against identity thinking on the left. For Swift, the difficulty with today's left is most of all that it takes up its own struggles, not as a tool outside itself, but as a part of itself in itself. The left acts not to change, but to find its own identity in the world as it is. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel writes that the beautiful soul, lacking an actual existence, entangled in the contradiction between its pure self and the necessity of that self to externalize itself and change itself into an actual existence, being conscious of this contradiction and its unreconciled immediacy, is disordered to the point of madness, wastes itself in yearning, and pines away in consumption. Still, there are two ways to consider the beautiful soul. The first is as a moral beauty held in suspension, perhaps behind glass. The other is as a figure on the verge of dissolution. What the left, the working class, the Marxist left must begin to understand and accept is that in order to realize themselves, they will have to accept their own eventual irrelevance and their own eventual disappearance. Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.